So I'm Jessica Rohr, and it is my delight to be able to moderate this panel on building imaginary worlds. Of course, we've heard earlier today from one of our panelists, Dr. Matthew Dickerson. He obviously demonstrated great skill in talking about Tolkien's work and Leaf by Niggle, but he also is a fantasist and an author of fantasy in the tradition of Tolkien and Lewis himself, most recently with his, now Dr. Dickerson, I have read all of your very helpful language appendices in your novels, but I did not see how to pronounce, so I hope I'm getting it right. Is it Daemon? Am I getting that right?
I like that. That's good. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Think of the G as in filet mignon.
Oh, okay. So Daemon. I'll get that right by the end. Which consists of the novels The Gifted, The Betrayed, and then Ilengond. And our second panelist is Hanna C. Howard. She's an OBU graduate and young adult fantasy author. Hanna writes fantasy with a classic bent in the tradition of Robert McKinley, Kristen Kishore, and Garth Nix. She spent most of her childhood wondering how she might avoid growing up, and eventually solved the conundrum by becoming an artist and a writer. She considers tea an essential food group, has more books than shelf space, that's my problem as well, and thinks the ultimate geek triumvirate is Harry Potter, Lord of the Rings, and Doctor Who. She lives in Tulsa, Oklahoma with her husband Dan, who is here today, I believe, yes. Their son Edmund, a dog, and a cat. Her novel Ignite the Sun was released in August 2020 and is available at Magic City Books, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, the Book Depository, and Goodreads. And if you're interested in novels by either of our panelists, I believe we will have some for sale outside later on today, so check those out. All right, so without further ado, I want to present our opening question. And this is probably the question that novelists I hear dread the most, which is, for those who have not read your book yet, or your trilogy, in Dr. Dickerson's case, could you give a brief summary? And I believe we'll start with Dr. Dickerson this time around, and then let Hanna present hers as well.
Thank you, and hi, Hanna, and hi to everybody else out there. And yes, this is, in some sense, it's a hard question. I think it's like asking a poet, what is your poem about? To which the only real response is to read the poem. Because what it's about is the whole thing. I mean, but it is also a good question. I'm not criticizing the question. It's a great question. It's a great one to think about. And it's one that publishers and publicists will ask us and make us answer. And it's one we need to be ready to answer. In some sense, my novel is about characters facing life circumstances and making decisions. But of course, that's true about all fiction, right? We all have choices, and our choices both reflect and shape who we are, and our choices have consequences, and we all live with our choices, but we also all have to live with the choices other people make. And that's really what drives my novel is character. It's characters making decisions. It just so happens that these choices are set in a different world. And so part of the story is also about that world. But again, our choices have consequences. How do you summarize that for this particular book? Maybe a few salient points. Like many fantasy worlds, there is a more visible external battle against evil beings in this book. In my case, they take incarnate form as great, powerful winged beasts. But as is often the case, the worst impact of evil is not necessarily the physical external one, but the internal ones, the challenges we all face in our own decision-making and how we will respond to that. Maybe one last thing is that mine is a world in which some people have gifts that have various benefits to their communities, either in the battle against this incarnate evil creature, or maybe they're gifts that have an artistic value, but the gifts also bear a cost to those who use them. And not everybody has these gifts. So that's part of the exploration as well. In fact, the first book is titled The Gifted. So I think that's probably the quickest summary I could give.
Well, I would agree that it is always hard to sum up what you've written because you don't write it because it's an easy thing to sum up. You write it because it requires a whole book. But that being said, I've been recently in my work on a new project, hammering hard at the sort of dreaded log line, the selling sentence or two that you pitch your book with. And so I'm in my efforts this morning to apply that same sort of formula to this book. I'm gonna try and sum up what it is. So essentially, Ignite the Sun, which I brought up here to show you because I think it's beautiful, it's about a teenage girl who is both insecure and anxious, who lives in a world that has no light. She's never seen the sun. And early on in the book, she discovers that she has sort of this latent sun magic that, you know, of course, what do you do with that when you don't really even know much about the sun in the first place? So her journey is a literal one of light against darkness. It is a literal journey book. So she travels north with some rebel companions who want to help her overthrow the darkness. And her quest is to restore the sun to her world. And of course, in so doing, she also discovers herself. She learns how to be courageous, and she learns to accept the person that she is.
Very good. So this is a panel on building imaginary worlds. So obviously we're going to be talking a lot about world building. So I'm curious for both of you, what was the process that you took to create your fictional worlds of Gondile in the case of Dr. Dickerson and then Luminor in Hannah's case? So walk us through a little bit of what that was like. Did it come to you in an image? Well, you know, of course, Lewis, of course, is famous for having that image that kicks off his creative process. What was that like for you? I'll let Hanna take this one first.
Well, for me, the world building or the world creation, I guess, for my world, was directly related to or grew from the kind of germs or seeds of the story itself as I knew it at sort of the very beginning. So I initially knew that I had a story I wanted to tell about something called a sun child, a creature that had a connection to the sun that could be sort of used in a magical way. And then in the course of exploring what I wanted to do with that, I sort of realized that the best way to give her a challenge would be to remove the sun. And so that gave me a world that was dark. And so then from there, I had to sort of figure out why. Why is this a dark world? What's happened to make it that way? And so that gave me some history to work with. And then, you know, of course, building the implications of a world like that. What happens if you don't have sunlight? Well, if you don't have any sunlight at all, I'm afraid to say your world turns into a rock of ice and you all die. So I had to work on what are some ways we can avoid that fate, but also really have some consequences of no light. So if that calls in a magic system that holds the light out to some extent, but lets enough through in a filtered sense that the world can continue to exist, but maybe not flourish. And then what happens in those places where it's the most dark? All the plant life that we would know has to die. And then, you know, it's their resilient stuff that creeps back in. And so for me, the process was kind of the organic growth from what I knew to what had to come next. Excuse me. And then another part of the world creation was, what do I want to have in this world that I'm going to spend a lot of time in? Frankly, I would assume it's like this for other fantasy writers. What do I think is going to be really cool to write? And so that led me to putting in a lot of kinds of creatures and races that I was really excited about. And because I already knew that sun magic was going to be there, it sort of gave me an avenue to create other kinds of elemental magic. If I created, or if I connected sun to sort of the fire element, then I could have a creature that was connected to water, and one that was connected to the earth, and one that was connected to the air. So one part organic growth and one part, what do I want to play with, kind of was my process for this book.
So two answers to the question. One, evil, I think, impacts the world, it impacts the landscape, it impacts all of nature. And so in some sense, there was a question for me, what is the impact of evil on a landscape? So this novel began with a scene for me, a scene and a character. And it's actually the scene on the cover of the first book, which is now sitting behind me. That scene just popped into my mind, and I wanted to explore it. As this evil took incarnate form, what was the impact on people, and what was the impact on the landscape itself? So I really didn't know the world. I didn't know the characters. I didn't know what was happening. And my goal was to get to know the characters first. So I've spent probably couple chapters just writing, and one of my favorite authors, Walt Wangren Jr., who wrote the Book of the Dun Cow and many other novels. I remember many years ago him talking about the way we cycle into a story to getting to know our characters. We give our characters situations to respond to, and that's how we get to know them. We get to know them by seeing how they respond and what they think. So I began to get to know some of the characters, and then I began to explore the world as I went. And so the second thing, one is a sort of the scene. What is the impact of evil on our world and on us? The other thing is, if any of you have read J.R.R. Tolkien's essay on fairy stories, he begins with this comment that I'm just sort of a wandering explorer in a realm full of wonder, but not of information. So I entered my world as a wandering explorer, and I'm trying to discover it as I go. So what are the cultures like here? What are the peoples like? What is the art? How does the art of this people reflect the geography? How does the art of this people reflect their beliefs? And then as I began to explore the details of particular places where my story took place as I went, at some point, then you also I sort of had to pause and drop out and take a big picture and literally map out more of the world and its peoples so that I could be consistent with consistent and interesting histories and cultures and landscapes. But it was still very much a process of exploring a world with wonder, beginning with the idea of discovering and delighting in what I discovered and that's true of both the characters and the world. It much more felt to me like a process of discovering and exploring a world and discovering characters than creating them. I was learning about them rather than making them up, was very much what it felt like to me. But it really began with this image, this scene, and I wish I could hold it up because this crops it in my view to just a little bit of the first book cover. But that was, if I back out of here, that was the opening scene that really prompted, and that's the first chapter of the book. The first chapter of the book is all I had to go on when I started writing.
This is kind of a follow-up question on that, which is, so how long did that world building process take for you? And then you both mentioned magic systems as being really important to the development process. Was the magic system something that developed organically within your world building? Or did you sort of see it as a separate entity that developed separately from, say, the history or the topography of the world that you were creating? I'll let Hanna take this one first of all.
Yeah, can you just phrase the question one more time for me?
Sure, yeah. So I was curious, you both mentioned kind of the development of the world as you were and I was wondering how long that process took. And then the magic system that you both mentioned, was that something that developed organically along
Sure.
with the geography and topography and history, or was it something that you saw as a separate entity that had to be developed?
Yeah, I think for me, the level, the aspect of enchantment really developed with the whole world. To me, it seemed integral to the world. Like everything in the world had to be integral to me. It all had to fit. Just like the art of a particular culture had to fit with the history of the culture and the geography of the culture, what sort of instruments they played, how the level of enchantment seemed to have to make sense. So I was again discovering that as I wrote, exploring it as I went. My characters face challenges. They face loss. They face hardship, and they make choices. And those to me reflect the world that we live in. But there's this fantastic setting. This, again, you use the word magic. We could also use enchantment. That enables me to explore those challenges and get past the sort of defensive mechanisms we build up within ourselves.
Yeah, I would agree with all of that. I think for me, maybe the magic side of my world was more exploration based, kind of trial and error sometimes. Playing with an idea or a way of operating magic, or a system of magic, and discovering, oh, that doesn't really actually work in this world or in this story. I think too, your world and your magic, you want them both to be relevant to the story that you're telling, and so I think for me, kind of like the idea of the story in the first place started with my character who had this power. Hers also was the first magic that I developed, and that kind of had to go hand in hand with the story that she was engrossed in, or that she was a part of. And so as I worked out, what that story was, I also was able to kind of piece together what her power was, and sort of learn it alongside her. There were definitely brainstorm sessions where I sat down and made lists, and a lot of it for me was figuring out like what feasibly goes with sunlight. What things does the sun do for us in our world already, and how can I kind of use that information to kind of push it past the bounds of reality and make it something more magical, yes. And so once I had serious magic figured out, I was able to take that as a kind of template for the other kinds of magic that would, I guess, go along with hers, or that would be of the same system as hers.
Very good. So Matthew, we'll start with you on this one. I'm curious, so obviously this is a genre choice that you both made to write in this realm of fantasy, and I'm curious, obviously there's a lot of cool stuff that you get to do in a fantasy world that you might not necessarily get to do if you were writing a literary piece. So I'm curious, what was your thought process on that? Did you always know that you wanted to write in the fantasy genre? Or was that, did you consider things that you could do with fantasy that you might not necessarily be able to do in other genres?
Hanna or me? Where should we start this one? I think it's Hanna's turn.
You, Matthew, that's
My
okay.
turn?
Yeah.
Well, do you know the story of the prophet Nathan when he goes to speak to David? And one of the things that's clear to me of the story is if Nathan went and started talking to David about what David had done, I think Nathan would have found his head on the ground pretty quickly. I don't think David was really willing to listen to that. But in this imagined setting, David was able to hear things from Nathan and apply it to his own setting as he needed to. So I think one aspect for me is, in terms of the real world, again, as I said earlier, characters face challenges. They face loss, they face hardship, they also experience joy and delight. And those things reflect, to me, the real world we live in. Again, everything to me comes down to character and wanting to build realistic characters, and even wanting to provide heroic characters. And by that, I don't mean perfect people who do everything right, but people who do draw us imaginatively into a sense of aspiration. Characters that you might want your kid to want to learn from or model, including recognizing that none of us are perfect, that we all have flaws. So all of that is drawn on reality. But I think putting it to an imaginative or a fantastic setting, a setting where enchantment is visible in a way, or real in a way it's not in this world, I think it allows us to see those things with new eyes. So that's part of it. Part of it also gets at what I shared in my keynote address, which is, I think God made us as imaginative, creative beings. And so, a painter might paint a scene that painter has never been at before. Painters may create new worlds they're painting. And even if a painter is painting a scene that they've been at, they may paint that scene in a new way or a different way. They're sort of adding to the reality. So I guess a second aspect is that in creating a fantasy world, it is an act of creation. It is like painting a scene that I've never been at before. And it allows me to exercise creativity. So again, the fantastic setting enables me to explore challenges in character that get past the defensive guards that readers may build up. In that sense, my big goal in fiction is I want to build sympathy with people through the imagination. I want to help people learn to understand the world and practice seeing the world through someone else's eyes. That's so desperately needed in the world today, the ability to begin to see things through other people's eyes. But it also is this practice of the creative art of making something new, imagining something new, bringing something. It's not quite something out of nothing. It's not creation ex nihilo like God does, but it is something that's in imitation of that. It is making something really new that hasn't been there before. Composers do that, right? Every composer, every melody, a composer is making a new melody. They're not just playing the same melodies over and over again. And this is sort of that expression of the new melody, the new painting, the something that hasn't been before that I am bringing into being.
Yeah, I totally agree with all of that. I did not come to fantasy first. I have loved writing for as long as I can remember. And I wanted to be a writer as a career since I was in 10th grade. But then I thought I would write Christian fiction romance. And so that evolved. Of course, when I came to OBU, I decided I wanted to be a serious literary writer. I was going to be the next great American novelist. And then, of course, I eventually found my feet where I think that I belong. And that is in fantasy and fairy tale. And the reason for that is a lot of what Dr. Dickerson was saying, but I find in fantasy a place to work through reality. I think reality is really complicated and hard, as we all know anytime, but especially this last year. And sometimes working through a thing when you're in the middle of that thing is just impossible. You need space to get away from it, to process it. And fantasy, I think, in my experience, it's not like this for everyone, but in my experience, does that, allows for that better than almost any other mode of transportation. And so I think, I think that you can get sometimes a firmer grasp on truth when you can have it through a different lens, a different way of looking at it. Dickinson's, tell the truth but tell it slant idea. Fantasy is just, for me, a way to tell the truth slant. It's a way to get at the hard parts of reality, the good parts of reality, really like what it means to be human. But to come at that in a way that almost is easier than trying to do that in the real world or in a contemporary setting. And yeah, I think you can absorb things differently when you're doing it through the lens of story than you ever could just in your own brain by yourself. But for me, fantasy is that like extra lens of, I say distance, but it's extraordinary distance. It's magical distance. It's yeah. I'm not even sure if I know how to articulate what it is, but for me, fantasy is the best way to make sense of reality.
Can I add just something to that? I think this captures, I think this quote maybe gets at both what Hannah and I were both trying to say. This is a quote from Walter Wangerin Jr., a wonderful author. I would highly recommend his award-winning late 1970s and early book, The Book of the Dun Cow and The Book of Sorrows, are two wonderful mythic stories. Walt Wangerin writes the following: in order to comprehend the experience one is living in, he must, by imagination and by intellect, be lifted out of it. He must be given to see it whole. But since he can never wholly gaze upon his own life while he lives it, he gazes upon the life that, in symbol, comprehends his own. Art presents such lives, such symbols, myth especially, persisting as a mother of truth through countless generations and for many disparate cultures, coming therefore with the approval not of a single people, but of people. Myth is such a symbol, shorn and unadorned, refined and true. And when the one who gazes upon that myth suddenly in dreadful recognition cries out, "There I am, that is me," then the marvelous translation has occurred. He is lifted out of himself to see himself wholly. End quote.
That's exactly it. Thank you.
And beautifully put. It reminds me too of Tolkien's essay on fairy stories. He says something very, very similar there as well. And speaking of Tolkien, I mean, we're at the Lamppost Conference, so obviously we're influenced by Tolkien and Lewis. So I'm curious for both of you, and I'll let Hannah answer first. If you could talk a little bit about the influence of those two authors primarily, but then if there are other writers who have influenced your journey as a writer and who even now you go to for inspiration.
Man, okay, so I could spend all day answering this question, so I'm going to try and be brief. Tolkien was, for me, my first, bucket of cold water sort of experience of, oh my gosh, this is where I belong with fantasy. I came to The Lord of the Rings in high school when I was trying to write my first novel. And, probably every person who's ever read Tolkien, but certainly any fantasy writer, quite a lot of my early efforts at writing were just basically like Tolkien fan fiction / ripping off Tolkien, because I saw a master at work and I wanted to be that. I think, I don't think you can overestimate Tolkien's impact on modern fantasy. That being said, though, I think what I love most about his work and what has impacted me or influenced me the most about his work is, I think, his unabashed embracing of what is good. He's not, right, step back. Lewis, who I also love, You know, if you have done any studying about the two of them, you know that Tolkien didn't always approve of Lewis's sort of bolder efforts at communicating truth. His more allegorical stories were not Tolkien's favorite method. And I'm more in Tolkien's camp. I think, you know, writing truth in the context of fantasy, telling stories as Nathan did David, you know, that contain the truth without trying to bludgeon you over the head with it, is definitely my methodology. But Lewis too is, he's a storyteller, and both of those men and their books have just, I mean, they've formed me as a person. They've formed me as a writer. They have shown me, I guess, how you can write beautiful and charming and true stories without them being sappy and sugar sweet. Yeah, so I would say both on a storytelling and an actual prose level, both of those men have been an enormous influence on me. I love the way Tolkien just doesn't care at all how long it takes him to describe something beautiful. I love that, and lots of people get bogged down in it, but language for Tolkien was master, right? He was a linguist, and he didn't mind taking a long time to convey the beauty of the thing. And I think that, you know, I write YA, which is fast-paced. The kind of unspoken rule about young adult fiction is that every single word on the page has to be there for a reason. And sometimes I get a little bit bogged down by that because I want to linger over the beautiful things, even if it doesn't necessarily propel the plot forward. But yeah, so both of those men as storytellers, I would say, influenced me early on and continue to influence me now. And beyond them, some of the sort of, I guess, more prevalent influences on my writing life. I would imagine that most people who write for young people have been influenced by J.K. Rowling, the Harry Potter books. I think, you know, for a lot of people were like the first thing that taught them that they love to read. And that, as a writer for young people, that's what I want to be. I want to be someone who reminds readers that they love to read. So Rowling, my favorite book as a young person was Ella Enchanted by Gail Carson Levine. And it's still like my comfort book. And that's a fairy tale retelling. And so a lot of what I tend to write has a sort of fairy tale feeling to it. And I think a lot of that comes from the impact of that book on me. I'm also, obviously, you know, it's hard not to be a huge Austen fan. I love Anne of Green Gables. A lot of the old children's classics I'm a huge fan of. We mentioned Garth Nix, his Old Kingdom trilogy, not even trilogy anymore, it's more than that, but I love his storytelling, his world building. That's a good start. Like you said, we can go out all day. I know. Dr. Dickerson, how about you?
Before I get back to some specifics, for which I think I will get back and reference the wonderful way Hanna just explained that, I want to tell a little bit of a story that I think maybe gets at it as well. When a publisher signed me for my 3-volume novel, they obviously liked it or they wouldn't have signed me. But they then, as you go through the process, the novel was complete, but they go through the process as you refine it and edit it and get ready to publish it in 3 volumes of bringing in. They brought in an external editor to help, you know, make it more sellable. And so the first external editor, you know, finished reading book 1, and made all these comments about things that needed to change. Which is good, in a sense of getting someone else's eyes and finding out how to make it better. But there were several places in the story where she said, you can't do this, you can't do this, you can't do this, you can't do this. And I responded, well, wait a minute. Tolkien does that. C.S. Lewis does that. Stephen Donaldson does that. And she said, yeah, but if Tolkien were writing today, his books wouldn't sell. You need to make it more like Game of Thrones. And then throughout my story, place after place after place, her notes in the margins were, make it more like Game of Thrones. Look at this passage from Game of Thrones. Make your book more like Game of Thrones. So the sad thing, is for many, many reasons, I kind of dug my heels in and I said, I want to make my book better. I want to improve my prose, but I am not out to imitate Game of Thrones. I wasn't seeking to imitate Tolkien either. There was not a conscious way of me trying to imitate Tolkien. But what I wanted to accomplish, it turned out, it did a lot of things in the same way. By the way, there should be a warning to those of you out there. If you love Game of Thrones and you really didn't like Tolkien, don't read my novels, because I did dig in my heels and said, this is not the model that I am going to imitate. Not that I want to imitate Tolkien, but I'm not going to explicitly reject Tolkien in order to imitate GOT. So I'm not actually even disagreeing with that editor. Probably if my primary goal was sellability, she was probably right. More like Game of Thrones, less like Tolkien, probably would have made it more sellable today. But that was not a compromise I was willing to make. So I guess in retrospect, I think two things that I think were a Tolkienian influence, even if I didn't recognize it at the time or wasn't explicitly trying to copy them. One is, I'll use Hannah's word, of bludgeon. Right? I don't want my book to be bludgeoning people with sermonizing or with religious metaphor. I want a compelling character and compelling stories that will draw people into the reader, and let whatever truth or revelation or insights are there come through the story and through my subconscious as a writer. The second has to do with caring about what is good. And if you've only seen the Peter Jackson films and not actually read Tolkien, you might not recognize this. But Tolkien's stories are not full of battle and warfare. They're really not. He works really hard to avoid that. What Tolkien, in trying to portray what is good, is he spends a lot of words describing art and song and meals and hospitality and culture and relationships and trees. And he describes those things lovingly and with great craft because they are good and because they are important. And so I would say that the strength of my writing, and also the things that people don't care, that people don't like, would be that there's actually words and paragraphs devoted to the landscape, to the instrument and the type of song that someone sings when they come to this particular place. And someone sings a song, and we learn why that was important. Why did this village have tapestries, and what was the art on the tapestries? And I didn't just want to in a sense glorify violence and move from one moment of violence to another. I think that maybe that's in hindsight not what I was explicitly trying to imitate, but what I recognized through this external editor saying, be more like Game of Thrones, be less like Tolkien, what I realized the real influence there was.
Man, I could continue this conversation all day. This is so much fun. We are unfortunately running out of time though, and I do have one more question that I want to ask, and I know Dr. Dickerson has prepared a slide about this, so I want to give him the opportunity to speak first. Hanna will be here throughout the rest of the day, so maybe we can reach out to you over the rest of the day and just chat about this as we have a little bit more time. So the question is, For those in the room who are aspiring fantasy writers themselves, young writers, what advice would you give about the writing life and the writing process?
So I thought of, if I wanted to boil this down, 3 quick points. Here are 3 in terms of specifically, not just writing good fiction or writing good stories, but what specifically what I say about writing good fantasy literature. One is delight in the world itself. There's no reason to write fantasy literature if you're not into the actual imagined world. Get to know its ecology, its culture, its art, its history. Delight in this creativity. If you want a world that will bring delight to your readers, if you want a world where there'll be wonder and discovery and surprise for your readers, there has to be wonder and discovery and surprise for you as a writer. So delight in the world itself. Let the world itself be a character in your story. The second, I guess, relates to the story I just asked you. You really have to know your primary motive. I think you have to, is it really artistic, wanting to tell a good story, or, is your goal just something that's going to be commercial or commercially successful? Are you trying to develop your own voice and your own goals and your own values, or you just want to figure out what's going to make your book sell? Of course, you already know where I stand on this. That doesn't mean you have to be in the same place, but it probably does mean when you get into the stages of actually writing it, that you know what's most important. And then the third, and I say this specifically for maybe an audience of Christians, and it gets back to Hanna's bludgeon. If you have a moral or spiritual or theological point you really, really want to get across in your book, don't write your book. Write a sermon and not a work of fantasy literature. If you have a sermon, then write a sermon and preach your sermon, but don't try to write a work of fantasy literature. Write a work of fantasy literature if you have characters that you want to get to know, if you have a story that you want to tell, if you have a world that you want to explore, and not a bludgeon.
All right, those are excellent pieces of advice. Let me check on our time. I think we have time for a couple of questions from the audience. If you have any questions, shout them out and we'll repeat them as needed.
Mr. Dickerson spoke a little bit on this, but what could you speak a little bit to your experience breaking into the industry as a new writer?
Yeah, that's great. I'll just repeat that into the microphone in case it was difficult to hear. So we had an audience member ask about experiences breaking into the industry and the publication process.
Yeah, so if I were giving advice to an aspiring writer, the piece of advice I always give is persevere, which is not always the most fun thing to hear. For me, this is my debut novel. It's the fourth or fifth book I wrote, and it took from first draft publication 10 years, just about. Now that's an exceedingly long time, even in the publishing industry, but it's still it's a long journey. And I don't think I knew that coming out of college, certainly not. And so it's just it's a long, it can be a slog, sort of pursuing traditional publishing, and a lot of it is get up, get back on the horse, do it again. There's sort of, and it really does depend on what kind of traditional publishing or what kind of publishing you want to do. But if you want to go one of the big, I would say big five, but I'm not sure if it's still five. Just recently, one of the houses was being bought by another, and I'm not sure if that ever went through. In any event, the big houses that everyone's heard of, if you want to be published through one of those, you need to have a literary agent, and to do that, you have to have a book that's as perfect as you can make it. You've got to be able to write a compelling query letter. You've got to be able to pitch your book. So there's like all these skill sets in addition to just writing, that I never really knew that you needed to have those things in order to get where you want to go. So, the internet is a really, really helpful tool, even though it's also problematic sometimes. So just, I would say, if that's the route you want to go on, do your research, do your homework, read blogs about how to query agents, and always be working on your craft. Read books, keep writing, keep developing your voice. So for me, it took 3 books and hundreds of query letters before I signed with an agent. So I started that process probably the same year I graduated from OU, which was 2008. I signed with my agent in 2015, and she and I worked on it on this book for almost 5 years together. Part of that was slowed down because of life events, but yeah, so that was my process. It sold in 2019 and came out this last August. So it's a slog, man. And you gotta really want it if that's the route you're gonna pursue. But if that's what you want, then like anything that is hard, you will and should persevere.
Dr. Dickerson, would you like to add anything in our last couple of minutes to that question about breaking into the industry?
Well, my path was so unusual. My first novel was accepted without an agent, and by the first publisher I submitted it to. And I thought, oh, life is easy. And then it was, 14 or 15 more years till my next book was published, and 20 more years till my next novel was published. So life turned out to be a lot harder than I thought. I started writing. It was really hard to write when I was in college and first into graduate school, because you just don't have the time. And if you're in a novel and you leave it on a table for 10 or 12 days, I just can't pick it up and pick up where I left off, because I've lost my narrative voice. I've lost my train of thought. So if I have an hour every week to write, or every 2 weeks to write, I can't do a novel, because the whole hour is just spent getting back to where I was. So I started writing short stories, short fairy tales, and short science fiction stories. Sent them off to a publisher, naively, around early in graduate school. The publisher wrote back and said, really love your narrative voice, love your stories. Short stories don't sell by unknown authors. Doesn't matter how good the stories are. People buy short stories generally because they know you, because you've been published in lots of journals. But he said, but if you ever write a novel, I'd enjoy seeing it. So of course I kept the letter. 3 years later, wrote and finished a novel, sent it off, and he accepted it and published it. And that was great. Except it didn't happen again for 20 years. So I think everything that Hanna said is actually the good advice and the best advice. The only thing I would add is keep my second question in mind. What are your real goals? If you don't really love writing, don't do it. Don't start. Don't start writing simply because you want to be published, because you love the fame, the idea of the fame as an author. You need to write because you are drawn to writing, because you love to write. You need to be willing to write because you would write even if nothing ever got published, because you have to write. And if that's not the case, then everything is just sales and formula, and you're on a very different path than I'm on. The path that I'm on, the advice I would give you is, would only be for those people who love to write so much that you will write whether it's going to be published or not. And then you write it because this is what you want to write. And then sort of afterwards, then you look for the publisher who wants to publish it. But you're writing what you want to write because you think it's worth writing.
Thank you so much. And we are unfortunately out of time. So if you would join me in thanking our 2 panelists today for their work. So Hanna will be around. She's doing a reading, I believe, this afternoon, correct? Midnight the Sun, so make sure to check that out to hear more from her world. And we'll also hear from Dr. Dickerson later today as well. So thank you so much.